Hey y'all, welcome to this week's episode of Stranger Stitches, where we take a candle into the darkest corners of history and the tragedies of true crime. I'll sprinkle them with just enough sweet tea and southern charm to keep it civilized. This story is compiled from public sources and is not a news article. We just sitting here on the porch telling tales like folks do. So, pick your poison. Sit that shapely ass down and buckle up, Buttercup. Today we are diving headlong into the belly of the beast, and let me tell you, it's darker than a new moon down there. So, a life gets started on the left foot and never got right. Some babies are born under a lucky star, and others, well, they just get born. Jack Henry Abbott was hatched in 1944 to what you might call charitably unfortunate circumstances, and bless his heart, that boy spent virtually his entire life in prison. Can you imagine? No, don't imagine that. That's not good. His criminal record began at the tender age of 9. 9 years old, y'all. That was when he was shipped off to a reform school like a package nobody wanted to claim. By the age of 11, he had what was described as a lengthy criminal record, and it'd always be longer than his resume, that's for sure. Now, I don't know about y'all, but when I was 11, my biggest crime was volunteering to vacuum under the sofa cushions and keeping all the change. That's right, I'm a criminal. I never said a word, and that money was mine. But this child, he was already put into a system that was just designed to chew kids up and spit them out. I don't know the circumstances that led him to be sent there, and I always feel a tug at the old heartstrings when I'm writing about a criminal's childhood, but I need to get real honest with myself. There could have been a perfectly good reason to send him there. Jack Henry Abbott described himself as a state-raised convict, which is about the saddest thing I've heard all week. This boy entered the juvenile detention centers before he was even 12 years old. And to my imagination, that is not a childhood. That is tragedy swaddled in legal proceedings. His early offenses included failure to adjust to foster homes and forgery. Okay, but let's call it what it is. Some foster care isn't great, not even now. Back in the day, it was even less so. There were fosters that signed up just to get that monthly check, and we don't know what was going on at these homes he was at. So maybe the lockup felt more familiar. He knew what to expect there. Could be a case of the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And forgery. I want to take a look at that for just a second. What is a kid forging at that age? A parental signature, a teacher's signature? He did something wrong to get something he wanted or needed. Now, I'm going to tell you another little confession. When I was in high school, my mom wrote a couple notes she didn't know about. And for no nefarious reason, I just didn't want to go to gym class on calisthenics day. But his pattern was beginning to define himself already taking shape in those formative years. It's like watching a storm develop. Here was a young boy caught in a system that was designed more to contain them than to teach them, and more to punish than to rehabilitate. It was a warehouse for human beings. And I feel like at times that these lockups keep people there until their time is served, and after that, the change is still up to the individual. Classes in rehab in prisons and these sort of child development centers don't teach real world skills. They can talk the talk, but when it comes to walking the walk, that is a completely different story. It's heartbreaking for those that have sincere intentions. But if we want to ever think his story gets better, well, we'd all be wrong. His violence escalates and goes from bad to worse. So by 1965, he's 21 years old, and Abbott was serving a sentence for forgery, but this time it was stolen checks, and he was at the Utah State Prison, where he stabbed 2 fellow inmates. Yeah, a prison officer testified that Abbott had snuck up on the men from behind, specifically targeting one, who died at the prison infirmary 10 days after the attack. The other one passed pretty quick. Abbott later claimed that one of them had made unwanted advances on him, and he was acting in self-defense, believing that the other inmate was planning to act on his urges. Never said why he took out the other one, but he was given a sentence of 3 to 23 years for manslaughter. Now that's quite a wide spread. 3 to 23. Okay. But no matter what transpired, this is something that would mark him forever as a dangerous man in the eyes of the penitentiaries and the law. And once you get that reputation, it sticks to you like shit on a tennis shoe. In 1971, yeah, he escaped from jail because sitting around was not his strong suit. And while he was out, he robbed a bank in Denver before he got recaptured. And I think it was only like a month or so until they got hold of him again. Well, they hauled him back in and added another 19 years to his sentence, which at this point was getting pretty long. He was looking at being a very old man by the time he got out. And this wasn't just another crime. This was a selfish bastard who couldn't do his time like a man. The escape attempt revealed something fundamental about Abbott's character, his complete inability to take responsibility for his actions and refusal to serve the sentence he'd earned by killing the other human beings. Well, he'd taken 2 lives, and instead of accepting the consequences, he decided he's going to terrorize some more innocent people and rob a bank. Every choice he made put more folks in danger. Every choice showed he gave exactly 0 shits about anyone but himself. Nothing is redeeming about a coward who won't face the music. But he wasn't going to sit around and waste time. While he was incarcerated, this arrogant little bastard learned about Norman Mailer's correspondence with Gary Gilmore. It was in research for that book called The Executioner's Song. Abbott felt that Gilmore wasn't telling the truth about what was really going on behind the bars, and that Abbott himself could give a much more accurate account. The sheer audacity of him inserting himself. Okay, well, Mailer himself, yes, that's Norman Mailer, had a history of violence. In 1960, he stabbed his second wife, Adele Morales, and nearly killed her. Well, he received only a suspended sentence, which, well, he got off pretty easy for someone who almost murdered somebody, but he was wealthy by then and he could afford a good attorney. Mailer saw something of himself in Abbott, another violent man who could write really pretty words about the darkness. So Abbott began writing letters to Mailer, inserting himself into this literary history because his narcissistic ass couldn't stand another killer getting more attention. But the Gilmore Project wasn't scrapped. That book went on to be completed. But the correspondence that they had was nearly one-sided. Abbott would write about, like 20-page letters, while Mailer barely acknowledged him and probably had his secretary do what response there was. Abbott had offered personal insights and stories about prison life, positing himself as the ultimate authority. Mailer ate that shit up with a spoon because he recognized that kindred spirit. What began as Abbott's desperate bid for relevance evolved into a collaboration between 2 men who believed their artistic talents excused a violent nature. And that's how the book, The Belly of the Beast, came about. It was Abbott's attempt to reframe his violent life as something profound. The book doesn't follow logical structure because Abbott was too self-absorbed to organize it coherently, and it just rambled on about grievances and justifications. Now, personally, I like a novel that rambles because I love a talented author that can tie this up, at least, like 90% tie it up for me by the end of the book, and that's part of the adventure for me. But this wasn't that. I read it, trust me. Abbott portrays the prison system as a bastion of brutality and dehumanization, but what he's really doing is setting up his excuse factory. Every description of violence becomes another reason why he's not responsible for his actions. He details physical abuses, not out of genuine concern for reform, but to make himself look like a victim instead of a predator. And some parts of it I don't completely disagree with. He criticizes the justice system as rigged against the poor and marginalized, and not from genuine concern, because he's playing the victim card. He is. He advocates for rehabilitation programs that he never had any intention of taking, but he did know what people wanted to hear. And this wasn't insight. It was a predator learning to speak the language of his prey. Abbott didn't find intellectual freedom through literature. He found a con he could play. Writing became his most effective weapon, and his correspondence with Mailer was calculated manipulation of this author's ego, because narcissists are so easy to play like that. So, Norman Mailer spearheaded Abbott's successful bid for parole in 1981. So he does 10 years further from when he escaped for bank robbery and killing 2 people. And he only serves another 10 years. But Norman Mailer convinced officials that Abbott was a great writing talent. He petitioned for Abbott's early release on cultural grounds. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Despite the misgivings of the prison officials who questioned Abbott's mental state, and truth to tell, Mailer would kick a beehive to get attention. And he publicly stated that culture is worth a little risk. As long as it's not his risk, what would he care? And those words would come back to bite him in the ass like a cottonmouth. Abbott said for himself, "At this moment, I am 37 years old, and since the age of 12, I have been free the sum total of 9.5 months. Yeah, that's a long time. And despite the misgivings, parole was approved. The prison released this 2-time killer with no real-world skill and no solid plan. Released him. Bye-bye. So, 6 weeks after his parole, Abbott went out with a couple of lady friends, and around 5 a.m., they stopped at the 24-hour Bennebon Cafe in New York's East Village. Abbott asked the manager there, Richard Aden, for a restroom, and he said it was out of order. So Abbott asked to use the employee restroom. And when Aden said no, because that's typical restaurant policy, no customers in the kitchen, and then Aden offered to show him a spot in the alley where he could go shake his lizard. And the 2 men stepped outside, which I thought was pretty weird too, but that's okay. What happened next became the defining story of Abbott's life. Over the years, his account shifted constantly. Sometimes he claimed that Aden had challenged him to a fight, or he thought that Aden had a knife, although none was ever found. But the end was always the same. Abbott grabbed Aden from behind and stabbed him in the chest, nearly severing his heart. Now, grabbing them from behind and stabbing them was the same thing he did to those people in prison. But in a heartbeat, it was all over. Aden lay dead in the alley. Abbott ran back in to the restaurant, all wild-eyed and crazy looking, and told his friends he had killed a man, and then hightailed it for parts unknown. The women waited there until the police arrived, gave their statements, and were never heard from again. And y'all want to hear some cruel irony? This is the best example I've ever seen. The next day, the New York Times ran an article about Abbott. Yeah, and it wasn't for the crime that he had committed. It was a book review of Belly of the Beast, not about the murder. The murders wouldn't get any print until the following day. So while Richard Aiden's body lay in the morgue and his family was receiving the worst news of their lives, the literary world was celebrating the man who put him there. Oh, my word. The book had earned significant public and critical attention, hailed and lauded as an entry in prison literature. I didn't even know that was a whole thing. The literary world had discovered a new voice, but it had come at a big and terrible price. So, Abbott hightails it off to Mexico. No forwarding address. But he can't get along in Mexico because of the language barrier, and he couldn't be bothered to learn, so he comes back to Louisiana. And, you know, all criminals, I hear them, we're heading south when the water gets hot. But I wish that we could just, put up a sign that says we're full, no vacancy, no more crazies here, we have our own. But he was captured after a couple of months, and he was working in the oil fields, probably one of the only jobs he'd ever held, and he never knew his book had been a success. He never kept up on the story, just kept his nose down and kept moving. He never knew about the book review. So he's rearrested and reincarcerated, and a very highly publicized trial begins in 1982. It was a freaking media circus, attended by Susan Sarandon and Christopher Walken and a slew of tabloid writers. The public outrage wasn't just about Aiden's death. It was a perfect opportunity to stick it to the Manhattan intelligentsia who thought their dinner party discussions gave them the rights to play judge and jury. Well, when Abbott's trial began, Mailer went on trial as well. As one writer noted, Time magazine tore into Mailer for believing the law should set up separate standards for artists. Have you ever heard such? One critic destroyed Mailer for swooning over criminals. This from a man who probably hasn't ridden a subway in 30 years and whose idea of violence is a catty confrontation with Gore Vidal. End quote. But Mailer, being the giant dumbass he is, doubled down on stupidity, advocating for Abbott again, arguing the killer could safely be released after what he considered to be serving a decent few years for the manslaughter. Okay. His quote was, "A democracy involves taking risks." That's what he told the New York Post. Yeah. And then he went on, and this was the headline. Norman Mailer said, "I'd help the killer again." Ugh. But after Aiden's murder, Mailer did concede that his involvement was another episode in his life which he can find nothing to cheer about. Other supporters admitted their advocacy was sort of a fraud, kind of a on the bandwagon thing. And, you know, when you can call your judgment fraudulent by your friends and your friends, you know you kind of fucked up. But Abbott was writing about what he knew, prison life and what he termed the heroic qualities of violent men. Describing the stabbing of an inmate, this is what he wrote. "You can feel life trembling through the knife in your hand. They always whisper one thing at the end, please." Comparing murder to a young man's first sexual encounter, he added, "You feel stronger." Now, that's some cold-blooded shit right there. He was convicted again of manslaughter and served, he was sentenced to 15 years to life. Aiden's widow successfully sued Abbott for $7.5 million, receiving all the royalties from Belly of the Beast. And that book that was meant to secure his freedom, could provide a little bit of justice for one of his victims' families. Now, Abbott's second book, My Return, came out in 1987. It was not successful. It wasn't even particularly well written. And that leads me to another theory. What do you think, that Mailer probably wrote more of the first book than we know? The style was different, and Abbott seemed to have lost his touch, and either way, the literary world had moved on. He was denied parole in 2001, and there was no press about this one. No one was standing up for him this time. He was denied because he failed to express remorse. On February 10th, 2002, Jack Henry Abbott died by suicide in prison at the age of 58. Abbott could never bring himself to express remorse for Aiden's death. His comment about it, from his own words, remorse implies that you did something wrong. If I am the one who stabbed him, I'm sure it was an accident. End quote. Abbott had lost the ability, or never developed it, to give a damn about anyone but himself. He saw other people as objects, obstacles, and opportunities, never as fellow human beings and anyone that deserved dignity, because he didn't have any himself. So what my little sordid tale raises is, can great art emerge from a corrupted soul? Yes, I believe that it can. It can also throw those beautiful works at me through the bars. I promise to catch them. Should society risk innocent lives for cultural achievement? No. He wrote the first book from behind bars, and he could sure write another one. The tragedy of Richard Aiden, he wanted to be a playwright. Yeah, and I just wonder if his stories would have been better than anyone of anything that Norman Mailer or Jack Abbott could have told. That's what I want to think. I want to think that I hope they have some transcripts of his work somewhere. I want to know that Richard Aiden stories would have been great ones. So, Abbott hanged himself with a bedsheet and a shoelace, and it is said that he left a suicide note, although officials will still not disclose the contents of that note. That's a tough one, because he had really made a nuisance of himself in prison, and he was a flight risk, and he was a security risk to other people around him. So, do you think there really was a note? Or the prison got tired of his celebrity status and let him go Epstein himself? Just a thought. But his life really was tragic from beginning to end. Norman Mailer said in his statement the Sunday after the suicide, he said, "I never knew a man who had a worse life." So in the end, what's it all about? Justice system failure? Well, that's a given. The seductive power of talent to blind us to character? Do we support art, knowing who that person is behind the lines? I don't know. See, there's a lot of controversial people out there, and I still will buy a book. But the belly of the beast consumed everyone who came in contact with it. Norman Mailer's reputation was never the same, and not that it was ever great anyway. Richard Aiden lost his life, and Abbott found that even literary fame couldn't free him of a prison of his own making. But that's my pontificating for today. What do y'all think? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for sitting with us and sharing a difficult story with me. That's me for this week. I'll see y'all next time.